Welcome to another submarine chat. This one is going to be about the ultimate submarine of World War I, arguably, the Project 50 Tauschschiff, which means diving ship. This was a cruiser submarine design from about 1917, 1918. Ultimately, it wasn't built, and therefore very little is known about it. But had it been built, then it would probably have been the largest submarine in the world by some margin, and in many respects, the most impressive. So really interesting design. I'm going to focus on the design here and what we know. Like my other chats, this is going to be unscripted. I have prepared some material, so let's get on with it. I recently did another video on steam-powered submarines, and I don't mean nuclear submarines, I mean boilers and fire and so on. One of the submarines I covered was the Project 50. I didn't have a cutaway of it at the time though, but I was inspired and I drew the cutaway. I draw these cutaways in MS Paint, and if anyone is wondering. There should hopefully, fingers crossed, be a link at the top of your screen now for that video if you haven't already seen it. During World War I, the Imperial German Navy was incredibly successful with U-boat warfare, with submarine warfare. There's some controversy around the unrestricted U-boat warfare and targeting merchant ships and so on, but in naval and military terms, there's no doubt that it was extremely effective. However, most of that action was by comparatively small submarines. This is a cutaway of a UC-1 mine-laying submarine that I previously did. Mine-laying submarines generally underrated, incredibly effectively, arguably the most effective submarine of World War I. But it's very small, and you can see that from the size of the bunks and the ladders and so on. It's a very small submarine. The Navy working with really big submarines was the Royal Navy. There was quite a few classes, and ultimately the K class. Now, this was a steam-powered cruiser submarine, so it's got a lot in common with the Project 50. The concept for the Royal Navy, though, was essentially a light cruiser, something that would operate in groups and in close proximity to the surface fleet, as part of the surface fleet, essentially, the submerged part. For that, it needed very high surface speed, and so they adopted steam power. The main reason to go for steam power is the surface speed. A diesel-powered submarine of the same time, even a large and powerful and fast one, could only manage about 15, 17 knots on the surface, whereas the steam-powered K-class could do 24 knots on the surface. For a similar reason, the Germans were looking to steam power. But what they actually built were some diesel-powered cruiser submarines. These were almost as large as the K-class. Their concept, though, was quite different. These were intended as commerce raiders, as lone wolves, as it were. They could operate at extremely long ranges. They operated near the equator, for example. I think 17,000 nautical miles is a typical endurance, and they were very heavily armed. You can see the size difference to a regular submarine. On the left, you have some UB class submarines, and on the right, you have U-139, which was a cruiser submarine. Only 3 of the U-139 class, or Type 139, were built. You can really see the difference in size, though. They were armed with a really successful gun, the SK L45 15-centimeter gun, or 150 millimeters. Not technically the largest gun on any submarine, but very large all the same. And a cruiser submarine would typically have 2 of these. That meant that they could engage targets at quite considerable range. They're also armed with torpedoes, of course. The largest and best of those cruiser submarines was the Type 142 or U-142. That's sometimes grouped with the 139 class. The other type of cruiser submarine from World War I is the Deutschland class. 7 of these were ultimately built. What's interesting, though, is that they were started life as tanker transport submarines, civilian submarines. That in itself is really interesting, means that they're short and fat, very large displacement, but not very long. They were converted to be cruiser submarines. And here you can see the typical, very wide casing on or deck on a German cruiser submarine with 2 of the 15-centimeter guns. This photo is actually from after it was surrendered at the end of World War I. Project 50 was to be much more ambitious, and it would combine the general concept of a cruiser submarine in the German Navy, so a commerce raiding, with the steam power similar to the K class in the UK. And that would have given it a very high surface speed, which allowed it to operate over larger expanses of ocean and more quickly respond. Specification is pretty impressive. It would have been the largest submarine in the world by some margin of 4,300 tons, 125 meters long, surface speed really fast, 25 knots predicted, which is just a little bit faster than the K class, and heavily armed with a large crew. Unfortunately, because it was not actually built, there are no photos of it. However, these plans seem to have survived, and the originals were uploaded onto dreadnoughtproject.org. Fantastic plans. What I've done is translated these into a cutaway illustration. So I draw these cutaways in MS Paint. Hopefully it brings it to life and makes it more easily understandable. Let's look at the boilers first. The center of submarine is dominated by the boilers. There are 4 of them, and these are what give it a really high surface speed. So they produce steam, which runs through steam turbines. They're underneath the funnels, which is a very distinctive feature of this submarine. The 4 boilers are placed as far on the outside of the submarine as is possible. Obviously, they have to be within a pressure hull, so they are sealed from the water outside, but they're not in the center of the submarine. Let's look at that from a different perspective. If you take the hull cross-section, submarines are essentially circular or long cylinders, shall I say, and the normal place to have equipment is in the middle, obviously, in the dry. So you've got water on the outside, dry on the inside. Like a lot of submarines at the time and today, these were double hull submarines. So there was another hull outside of that cylindrical pressure hull, and that would contain things like the ballast tanks, diesel, or in this case, oil for the boilers, and so on. Unique to this class, the boilers would have been placed essentially in that outer hull, but within spaces that are shaped to withstand water pressure and would dry on the inside. Not perfect cylinders, but certainly with curves, edges, and so on to withstand the water pressure. The funnel system would have gone out the outside of the pressure hull. I think there's a couple of reasons why they've done this. One reason is that one of the dangers of having boilers on a submarine, and one of the main limitations, was that they're very dangerous. If seawater gets inside the boiler or into the boiler compartment, it could cause various different types of explosion or chronic damage. If you have smaller compartments, you might limit the extent of that damage. Additionally, boilers make the submarine incredibly hot, and it was very uncomfortable submarines to operate. By placing them on the outside of a submarine, I imagine it would have been more tolerable than, for example, the British K-class. The turbines were on the inside of the submarine, so for each boiler there's a steam turbine, 4 in total, and that's what drives the submarine along. Looking back at the 3D, there's also a small room between each pair of boilers on either side of the submarine, and that is the fan room, so that's for cooling. So a lot of effort has been put into cooling the submarine. There's also batteries for underwater running. This is normal. But what is not normal is there's also two 6-cylinder diesel generators. I'm not certain, but my guess is that that is for recharging the batteries. It might also operate as a backup to the steam boilers. So the submarine has 3 power plants: steam, diesel, and of course the battery. That makes it very complicated, also a bit unique. I think I can't think of any other examples like that. Looking at armament, which also has to be extensive for a cruiser submarine. At the front of the submarine, you've got something that's incredibly typical, a torpedo room with torpedo tubes. There's 4 tubes and 8 reloads. That's quite a lot, but it's not particularly remarkable. Also unremarkable, at the back of the submarine, you have a smaller torpedo room with 2 torpedo tubes. Not certain whether or not there were any reloads for this, but there seems to be room if they'd wanted to put some. Where we get unusual is that there's a second torpedo room in tandem at the back. This one does have reloads, 2 torpedo tubes slanted out to fire around the aftmost torpedo room. And this has 6 reloads. It also appears that the reloads here could be passed through into the other torpedo room to shoot out the aftmost torpedo tubes. This configuration is already unusual, possibly unique, but in addition to that, there is another torpedo room, a 4th one, amidships, and this one is a particularly unusual, unique even design. This is the plans that are on Dreadnought project. There's 2 torpedo tubes, and they're swivel mounted on a turntable, so they can be aligned to exit hatches on both the left, which is the port side, or the right, which is called starboard. Once it's swung into place, a watertight seal has to be made. So this is quite a complex maneuver, and it has to be made watertight before the outer doors are opened and the torpedoes are shot, obviously. To reload, they have to align back to the front, and then there's a torpedo magazine with 6 reloads in the compartment ahead of it. This is unusual in a couple of ways. I cannot think of any other examples where the torpedo reloads are ahead of the torpedo tubes. So these must be loaded tail first into the muzzle of the torpedo tube. That's the opposite. Normally you load a torpedo in the back of the tube, the stern, and it fires out the front. Here, it would be loaded in the front and then shot out the front. Because it's on a turntable, of course, they can align to the other side as well. I do not really understand why they would have chosen this arrangement. It seems needlessly complicated and risky. Those watertight seals that have to be made would both delay the operation and make it more risky, in my view. Why not just have fixed slant launchers on either side? I don't know. But it's a very interesting design all the same. Of course, there were some guns, these classic 15-centimeter guns. There were 4 of them, so that's twice as many as the other cruiser submarines. They're arranged in pairs, and between each pair, there is a hatch for the gun crews. So the gun crews can exit submarine right where the guns are and get straight to action. Inside the submarine, there is ready-to-use munitions. So there's a compartment for munitions essentially underneath the guns. And my interpretation of the plans is that under each gun, there is a hoist system to get the shells up to the gun. So you can imagine people being very busy there when the guns are being fired. Further back in this is the aft one, so it's further aft, but on a lower level, you have a much larger ammunition store. Obviously, the rounds there have a lot further to go before they can get into a gun. So I think that's more for storage. And then the ready-to-use ammunition is much closer to the gun. What's also interesting is the the gun control. The sail of the submarine, or conning tower as we would call it at the time, had two floors. This is unusual. The bottom one is the normal one. That's the con. That's where the navigation of the submarine is done. The periscopes are there and so on. Above it, you have a dedicated artillery spotting room. And this has a stereoscopic rangefinder. That's that T-shaped object you see. Confusingly, this comes up between the periscopes. So presumably the periscopes have to be lowered for this to rotate fully. But what this means is that the guns can be aimed more accurately and from longer distances. The forward guns are ranged pretty much the same. They also have a ready-to-use magazine, although it's on the other side of the submarine, so you can't see it in this illustration. But let's talk about the accommodations. Quite interesting, it has a bath. This bath on the plans is labeled as an officer's bath, so presumably the rest of the crew couldn't use it. They also seem to have their own dedicated water closet. There's at least 5 water closets on the submarine, 127 crew. Not bad for the time, for sure. Also not bad for the time, the captain's cabin, single berth, so there's only one person in the room. On a normal submarine, even today, normally only the captain has their own cabin. But on this submarine, the captain, the first watch officer, which in modern parlance you'd probably call an XO or the executive officer, and also the engineer officer all had individual cabins, and then several other cabins only had 2 people in them. Most of the crew, of course, are in large berthing areas, and some are in torpedo rooms and so on, as you'd expect of submarines then and now. But the accommodations, at least on paper, appear to be quite extensive. I wouldn't say luxurious, but certainly quite comfortable in comparison to other submarines. Okay, the much larger resolution image, the original image, is on my website. The URL's at the bottom of the screen here. It's got 100 annotations and things to explore it at your leisure. It's a really interesting submarine. I hope you'll agree that sometimes the designs that are not built are the most interesting. The end of World War I came too soon for this submarine, so it's very much a what if. Also, it's debatable whether Germany had the resources to build this submarine. But if they had, it would have been the largest and probably the most impressive and probably one of the most famous submarines of all time. But as it is, hardly anyone's heard about it. Let's talk a little bit about the legacy, though. The submarine itself was not built, and it's largely forgotten. If it wasn't for those plans that the Dreadnought project came up, we wouldn't really have much of an impression of what the submarine was going to be at all. However, German cruiser submarines were quite influential. The British K-class was not. It was deemed a failure. Now, its failure was not so much its steam propulsion as the way it was being used as the British notion of a cruiser submarine, if you like. The German notion of a cruiser submarine as a lone wolf, a commerce raider, was picked up on by several navies. The Japanese Navy, starting in 1921, so straight after World War I, built the first of a series of cruiser submarines which were modeled on the German design, and in lots of ways similar. The ultimate of these was the I-400, which was an aircraft carrying submarine of World War II. This is the start of that series. The British also took away some lessons and built the HMS X1. This was a super submarine at the time, biggest submarine in the world, and it has some German influences, double hull, even the engines are from German submarines, actually. The British weren't able to build diesel engines big enough. It abandoned steam power, but you can see the guns are very large and so on, 4 of them, lots of parallels. I'm not saying it's a direct copy of German submarines. There's clearly a lot of British thinking in this, but it's definitely influenced by the German U-boat cruisers. The ultimate one, of course, is Surcouf. Apologies to anyone French listening, my pronunciation is terrible, but this is undoubtedly one of the ultimate submarines in the world ever. It's always on the top 10 lists of craziest, most impressive submarines. Certainly my list. Here's my cutaway. It's available on the website. If you go Covert Shores or HI Sutton, Surcouf, you can see the gun at the front. in a turret, so it's more elaborate even than the Project 50. Really cool submarine, but undoubtedly influenced by German U-boat cruisers. Okay, thank you very much. Hope you found that interesting. Please like, subscribe, please share it with people. As I say, it was unscripted, but thank you very much.